to the Deep Impact Investing Podcast with Kimberly Griego-Kiel on behalf of Horizon Sustainable Financial Services. In this podcast, I discuss sustainable impact investing, how to create portfolios that match your values, and a variety of other topics such as financial education, environmental sustainability, social justice, and sustainable food systems. Do you want to know if your investments seek the kind of accountability from corporations that you demand? Listen in as I explore the burning question, are you investing like you give a damn? Welcome. I'm Kimberly Griego-Kiel, your host of Deep Impact Investing. Thank you for downloading and listening to this episode today. My goal is to always educate you, motivate you, and provide solutions that you need to build a more sustainable life and a more sustainable investment portfolio. So today, I thought we would talk about the secret sauce of shareholder engagement. And I have with me a guest, Jonas Kron, who is the Chief Advocacy Officer at Trillium Asset Management. He also has a law degree in environmental law, which I find super interesting. And a little tidbit about Jonas that I didn't know. He made the list of Fast Company's 2022 most creative people in business. Thanks for joining me, Jonas.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Tell me just really quickly, what is this most creative people in business about?
So as far as I understand, Fast Company does this on an annual basis, and they identify a lot of different folks across the business spectrum on different and new ways of doing work. So last year, I think there was some antitrust regulators that had made it, worker organizing, and Trillium and myself, who were recognized for our work on worker rights.
Excellent. So it's really about the radicals in the business area, making change happen. That's great. Tell us tell me and the listeners, what does a chief advocacy officer do?
So I guess I have the privilege of running a team of 6 of us in all, that day in, day out, we are focused on engaging the companies that are in Trillium's portfolios. And we are active investors, so we are not invested in all companies. We are going to be choosing companies based on environmental, social, governance, and financial factors. Many of those companies, while they may be better performers, in some cases very good performers, there are often opportunities for them to do better, places where perhaps they need a little extra bolstering to keep doing the right thing. And myself and my team, we focus on engaging those companies on a regular basis. Topics like climate change or diversity, equity, and inclusion, toxic chemicals and products, worker rights, all those different things. One of the things that makes Trillium special is that for a firm our size, and we are a little over $6 billion under advisement,
Wow.
we have, I think, significant resources dedicated to shareholder advocacy, and whether you call it stewardship or engagement.
Right. And shareholder advocacy is one of my favorite topics, and I do talk about it frequently on different podcasts. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Tell me, what part of your job satisfies you the most? What's the best part and the worst part? Just briefly.
Sure. No, I think the best part is, really having the opportunity to make an impact and to make a difference. Companies have such a big role to play in our lives in so many different ways, whether it's us as consumers, as citizens, as employees. And shareholder advocacy is a very effective and powerful tool to make a difference there.
I agree with you 100%, 1,000% maybe even. So before we talk about some of the little juicy nuggets that you have from the most recent proxy season, talk to me about Trillium's approach to shareholder engagement. I know you have a multi-pronged approach, so just give us an overview.
We really try to use as many of the tools as possible that we have in the toolbox of shareholder advocacy. And for us, the question in many respects that it comes down to is how do you prioritize? There are so many different issues and so many different companies to work on, that the question is often, well, how do you decide which company? How do you decide which issue? And what approach are you going to use? And so For us, we go through an annual prioritization process every summer because shareholder advocacy often follows the sort of an academic year almost
Right.
schedule. We will wear a couple different lenses in going through that prioritization process. And real briefly, we'll look to see which companies we hold. We will look because we don't hold all companies, as I mentioned. We look to see what the bigger environmental, social, and governance impacts that those companies have, as well as looking at what are the material ESG issues, so which are the ones with a financial implication. And we're also going to be comparing that against Trillium's particular set of values and skill sets, which
Right.
are
I
something
just
that
want
we
to
talk about.
pop in
Yeah.
there. So with Trillium, you have specific areas that you focus on, just like most big firms, and because you can't do everything,
Right.
right? Yeah. So you're focusing on specific areas, which I think is important. Okay, go on.
Yeah, no. So we have to, and absolutely, I think there's certain table stakes issues that you really need to be working on no matter what, and I think
Like
those
climate change.
and equity,
Right.
I think are two big ones that you really need to have some sort of programmatic areas in. The only other things I was just going to add is looking for pathways forward and how clear is the pathway forward on a particular issue area. And actually, I think it's probably worth just pausing there to get it a little, maybe a little bit deeper of your question, which is
Yeah.
that sometimes there's engagements that the pathway forward is quite clear and you can see how a change can occur within a short period of time. But sometimes there are issues that really it's going to take a long time to move forward on the issue. And what we're doing is we are beginning that process of fostering a longer term change. And, one example of that is that Trillium was really one of the very first firms to do work on LGBTQ non-discrimination. And so we were going to companies back in the early and mid 90s,
Oh,
asking them to promise not to fire people for who they love or who they are. And at the time, there was not much of a pathway forward on that. That was
no, not back in the mid 90s.
it was a very difficult row to hoe. But over time, it got easier and easier. And eventually, like originally we would go to companies and they would look at us with blank stares and
What do you
pretend to know
mean?
what we were talking about. Like,
Yeah.
we don't have any gay employees. And of course, that was ridiculous.
Right. They're always there somewhere.
Exactly. So, but over time that changed. But over time meant 10, 15, 20 years. And so, I think that's one of, again, the things that make Trillium special is that we're in it for the long haul and we're ready to put in the time and effort when the issue is really important.
Thank you for that work. I appreciate it personally. And I'm sure a lot of folks do. And so what you're really talking about is here's some urgent things and here's some things that we have to take a longer view and process to.
Yes, absolutely.
I was reading your approach document and I was struck by the phrase, a shareholder resolution is a suggestion. So tell us what that means.
Well, so there's sort of the lay version of that and then the more technical legal
Oh,
version.
let's do the lay version because
Okay. Well, no, actually, like it's not actually that technical in sort
yeah.
of a way that can't be understood. But basically, under the SEC rules, the rules of the Securities and Exchange Commission that govern shareholder proposals, in order to file a shareholder proposal that requires a company to make a change, is actually quite difficult and pretty unusual. The common course is to make a suggestion. They're called precatory proposals. And so it's a recommendation for a particular course of action. And a lot of times it's not even a recommendation for a specific course of action, but it's asking for a report or a study on a specific course of action. And so, sometimes shareholder proposals are quite pointed. For example, have periodically filed shareholder proposals that have asked the company, suggested to the company that they stop doing political spending, period. Then there's other times when it's like, well, how about providing better disclosure about your political spending? And those would sort of be two different ways of doing it.
So those might be ramping up again as we go into 2024. Who knows?
Well, yeah, actually, it's sort of interesting. Like we've had a long period of time where companies have slowly and steadily started disclosing more about their political contributions and lobbying too. And I think an enormous amount of credit goes to the folks over at the Center for Political Accountability for being very disciplined about driving that increased transparency. But now that we have a lot of transparency, we can actually start seeing where a lot of those dollars flow. And that is revealing the contradictions that so many companies are perpetuating, where they will talk about the importance of LGBTQ rights and sponsor, pride events and then at the same time, they will contribute hundreds of thousands of dollars to state legislators that are moving pieces of legislation to prohibit transgender care in their states. And, the companies are on both sides of these issues. And so the question is, are they even any good at this political spending, given that they seem to be contradicting themselves so blatantly?
Oh my gosh, I see another podcast on that particular topic because it's so hot right now and personal to me. But let's talk about some of the other little nuggets that you have that we sort of talked about. But I want to mention a couple things first that we're not going to go into because I was really struck by the resolutions at Costco, but to ask about their reducing their toxic chemicals in products and in use there and tracking what they're doing. And that was very interesting to me because we think of a Costco as a pretty good company, right? And there's some labor rights issues that were shared with me around the Union Pacific Corporation and paid sick leave. So both of those really stuck in my mind. But you are going to share with us a little bit about the work at Bank of America. And I just want to stop and pause for listeners that any company that I mention in this podcast is not a recommendation for investment. Please talk to your financial advisor about that before you jump into those waters. Bank of America.
Bank of America is a company actually we've engaged for a number of years on climate change. And for the last couple of years, we've done something a little bit different with our shareholder proposal and our engagement there. And I think this is something that might start becoming more common, but I think is a really interesting way for shareholders to make a difference in maybe ways that they hadn't thought of before. So when you file a shareholder proposal, it gives you the right to present the proposal at the company's annual meeting. And that means usually you have about 3 minutes to explain what the shareholder proposal is, formally move it, and tell
you've
people
got to
why.
Be very concise on that.
Exactly.
3 minutes isn't very long time.
But it's a really unique opportunity where you've got the undivided attention, hopefully the undivided attention of the executives and the board and many shareholders. And so one of the things that we did at Bank of America is that we took the opportunity to bring in an activist who is working with communities in Louisiana's Cancer Alley to oppose a new plastic petrochemical plant that would affect their community. So the organization is called Rise St. James, and one of their leaders is a woman by the name of Sharon Levine. And Sharon was interested in speaking to Bank of America because Bank of America is a likely funder and source of loans for the project. And she is very interested in stopping this from happening and for getting her questions in front of Bank of America, which is not necessarily the easiest thing for her to do because we've seen and we know so many of these communities have been marginalized for so long and their voices really haven't been heard or given a platform. And so what we've really tried to do in this example is to pass the mic to Sharon and to give her an opportunity to have the undivided attention of the board members and the executives at the annual meeting. And we actually did something similar at another financial services company, Travelers. So at Travelers, we've been filing a shareholder proposal for a couple of years now, asking the company to do a racial justice audit. And for those that aren't familiar, a racial justice audit is basically asking the company to do a 360-degree review of the impacts that the company can have when it comes to racial justice. And the idea here is that they don't simply look internally at their their hiring practices and how inclusive of a workplace they have, but also the ways in which their products and their services and their supply chains and all the ways in which they touch communities around them, what sort of impact they can have there as well. And that shareholder proposal actually did quite well in its first year. It got a vote in the 40th percentile, which is very high for these kind of things.
Yeah.
Due to the anti-ESG backlash, and we can certainly talk about that, that vote went down slightly. But what we did was one of the issues of concern, one of the racial justice issues of concern for travelers is whether they will be providing insurance to companies that are seeking to do oil and gas drilling in the Arctic. And so,
fascinating.
Yeah. So the Gwich'in people, who are the folks that have lived in this region for time immemorial, have been opposing the development of fossil fuel activities in the Arctic Refuge because it's a sacred place for them. And what we did was, again, took the opportunity to pass the mic. And so what we did was we invited the leadership of what's called the Gwich'in Steering Committee to come to Connecticut to the annual meeting and to take our 3 minutes and to speak directly to the executives and the board of directors about their concerns. So
that has to be, sorry to interrupt you, but that has to be incredibly powerful, that it's not just the same old, presenting the proposal, but to really have someone say, this affects me, and here's how. That's great.
Right. Yeah, that this affects me, and that you, the people who are listening to me right now, can make a difference on this. And so this is something that we did a few times this past year, and actually we've done it a number of different times sort of going back, over the years. And it's always, I think, a very effective and powerful tool, and can be an important stepping stone in making some important changes.
It gives me goosebumps to think about that. I may have to tag along sometime just to see that in happening in the moment. I'm going to pause right here for a minute and let you know, listeners, that you can also create a portfolio of investments that builds on your ideas of sustainability and equity and diversity, climate change, all of those issues. There's probably 100 we could mention, but we want to make sure that you can match your values with your investments. So at Horizon Sustainable Financial Services, we're here to help you. With more than 2 decades of experience, our top staffer and owner, Johan Clausen, he is there to help you and answer your questions. So you can reach him at 505-982-9661 or send an email to info@horizonssfs.com. Don't be shy. Send an email, give a call. We're all happy to help you. Now, let's go back to Jonas and talk about a very wide-ranging topic on labor rights. So you probably have a lot to share in that area.
Yeah, and in some ways, actually, it really does connect back to the topic we were covering before, in terms of passing the mic and helping these folks who have not had a voice to have more of a voice, because in some ways that's, I think, really what the discussion around worker rights is right now. Absolutely, it is about pay or scheduling or benefits, or workplace safety and health. But in many respects, it's about workers finding their voice and wanting to say, this is what is important to me. Because actually, also picking up on the question of paid sick leave, I think it's great for investors, and Trillium is amongst them, to advocate for particular benefit policies or pay. I think that's important. But really, what's most effective is for the workers to advocate for what they want, and to have the ability to speak for, some workers may want better benefits, some workers may want better pay, they may want both of those things, or what are they going to be the trade-offs that need to be made? They really, should be the ones that are making those decisions. And, over the last few years, we've really seen, and I think we're just seeing every day another group of workers going out on strike, and a lot of work, unionized workers, whether it is, the screenwriters, the actors, or the auto workers, or healthcare workers, or teachers, they're already unionized. And in some ways, worker rights in this country are not particularly great, but unionized workers are at a relative pinnacle of power and they are exercising that power these days. But workers that haven't yet organized are really in a very different position. They don't have the structure in place. They don't have the recognition. They don't have the structures for reaching collective bargaining. So when workers are trying to organize for the first time and to have a union, it's a particularly precarious spot for them. So I think that is why the workers at Starbucks and their efforts has been particularly noteworthy, because not only is that a challenging situation for them to be in to organize in the first place, but they are in an industry that has historically been very difficult, to have workers organize.
Retail, right? That would be very
Exactly.
difficult. Yeah.
So actually over 2 years ago, we started seeing the developments pretty clearly. We saw workers organizing more and more. We saw some initial strikes that probably folks don't really remember, but John Deere was really getting close to a strike at the time, and we were seeing that, bubbling up. The New York Times workers were trying to organize as well. And then, we had the first 3 stores for Starbucks stores in Buffalo, New York, getting ready to vote in December of 2021. I'm sorry, 2020. And so we came together with a few other investors to write a letter to the company, basically saying that if these first 3 stores vote to organize, that we would really encourage them to come to a first contract as quickly as possible. And we were quite pleased to see over $1 trillion in assets join us in that letter. So it was about $1.2 trillion in assets join that letter. And we delivered the letter a few days after those first 3 stores organized. And it did lead to some reaction from the company and some meetings. But those meetings really were not as meaningful or substantive as we were hoping for. And then Howard Schultz came back into the CEO position. And because of the increasing number of workers who were trying to organize, the growing number of unfair labor practice charges, and the seeming resistance of the company to address the issue, we, as a group of investors, wrote another letter to the company. This time that was joined by $3.5 trillion in assets under management.
Wow.
Yeah, so it tripled within just a few months. So we were really seeing an enormous amount of interest from investors.
That's a lot more powerful to a corporation than you have significant assets at Trillium, but when you get all of these others joining you, it's pretty powerful position.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. So it's, Trillium is, a little over $6 billion in assets under advisement, which obviously $6 billion is a lot of money, but relatively speaking, it's relatively small. Starbucks has a market cap of, over $100 billion. We provided that second letter to the company and tried very hard to be having a dialogue with the company over the course of the summer. And that's often the course of these engagements. There's letters, there's meetings, there's efforts at having a dialogue with the company in the hopes that, we could reach a positive conclusion. And that, and I should say that we've held Starbucks for about 20 years in terms of, our investment in the company, and have worked quite successfully with the company on issues like plastic waste and food waste and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and going back even farther around bovine growth hormone and just even sustainability reporting. So, we were optimistic that we would be able to replicate those positive engagements again. But this issue seemed different. And we really weren't able to get a level of engagement from the company that we were hoping for. So what is often the next step is to file a shareholder proposal, which we did alongside a few other investors, including the New York City comptroller, who's effectively the treasurer of the city of New York, and one of the fiduciaries for the public pension funds for firefighters and police and teachers and so on.
But those are pretty big groups to be joining in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, the New York City pension systems are well over 200, if not $300 billion in assets. And then also a Canadian organization called Share, which is a shareholder advocacy group, and a UK-based organization called PIRC. And so the four of us came together and filed this shareholder proposal that it was a very sort of simple, straightforward ask. It said that Starbucks happily had made commitments to respect international labor norms under the International Labor Organization core labor standards. And those are standards that recognize and protect worker rights to organize and freedom of association at a higher level than US law. So they had said many years ago that we're going to hold ourselves to a higher standard when it comes to worker rights. And so our question was not, are you meeting US law, but are you meeting your commitments to meeting a higher standard? And we think you should bring in a third party assessor to look at that question and provide you with a report and to investors as well, talking about the ways in which maybe you are meeting those standards and maybe ways in which you're not meeting those standards.
I'm on pins and needles just waiting for you to tell me what happened with this.
So we filed the shareholder proposal in September 2022. The company really didn't say a whole lot until just before the annual meeting in March of 2023, when they started making some vague assurances that, well, actually, we're going to do a human rights impact assessment and we will include it in that assessment. But they didn't really put a timeline on it. They didn't say who was going to be doing it. They didn't really provide any details regarding it or whether the board was going to be taking responsibility for it or not.
Let me interrupt you. Do corporations do that as a stalling tactic sometimes?
Well, I think that was very much what they were hoping to do, that they were saying, okay, we get the sense that the investors are onto an idea that has some broad-based appeal. And maybe this is a way to cause investors to give them an off-ramp, to basically say, okay, the company seems to be getting it and they're going to do something, so we won't vote for the proposal. And that's not uncommon. And actually, if you look back at the votes in 2023 more generally, you see a lot of pretty large, big institutional investors taking that off ramp on all sorts of issues, really giving the companies the benefit of the doubt. And that's what they were saying. They were basically saying, trust us, we've got this, we understand. So we went to a vote in March of 2023, just earlier this year in the spring, and the shareholder proposal got a 52% vote. It got a majority vote.
That's great.
Yeah. And, that was one of the very few majority votes this year. Most shareholder proposals took a haircut of about 10% in face of the anti-ESG efforts. And it's also important to remember that Howard Schultz actually owns 2% of Starbucks shares. So, we can sort of factor that in as well. So, even though the company, I think, tried quite hard to persuade investors not to vote for the proposal, well over a majority concluded that no, this assessment would be a good idea. So at this stage, the company has indicated that they will be doing an assessment.
Great.
They have said very, very little publicly, and we'll have to see what they do. If I want to be optimistic, if folks remember back I believe it was in 2019, that Starbucks got caught up in one of the sort of earlier racial justice controversies when two Black men were arrested simply for being Black in one of their stores in Philadelphia. And the results of that was that Starbucks actually did one of the first racial justice audits. They brought in a law firm to do a complete review of how the company addresses racial justice and published, I think, what was considered at the time to be a pretty good report that did not pull punches, that said, okay, these are the things that you're doing well, and these are the things that you should be doing better. And if I'm being optimistic and hopeful, it will be that they will do the same thing, that they will treat this with the same seriousness and commitment to meaningful outcomes as they did with that racial justice audit proposal. But we're going to have to see. The proof will be in the pudding. So
what you're really saying is a lot of these they're not just one off. It's a continual process that you're always going after. So yeah,
absolutely.
That's great. I really appreciate it. And we're winding down here on this episode of Deep Impact Investing. So I really want to thank you, Jonas, for joining me here on this podcast today. And do you want to say anything, last words, talk about Trillium? I will say, and full disclosure, that Horizons uses Trillium in many of their portfolios, and they're quite popular with our clients. Last words?
Well, I really appreciate you having me on the podcast and your wonderful questions. Thank you very much for inviting me on. And I guess I would just maybe end by saying that Trillium has been around for over 40 years at this point. We have a deep commitment to sustainability and investing for a better world. And that's both through our investment process as well as through our shareholder advocacy. And we are always happy to talk about it and really appreciate the opportunity that you gave us today, Kim. Thanks.
Good. Because I'm thinking maybe July, I want to get you on and talk about what's hot that you're following at the moment. So we'll
that would
see.
Be great.
Yeah. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Deep Impact Investing with myself, Kimberly Griego-Kiel, with Horizons Sustainable Financial Services. Please join me for my next episode, where I think my favorite guy in the world will join us again, Johan Clausen, with some stimulating topic on behavioral finance. Thanks again for listening. I'm Kimberly Griego-Kiel, reminding you to live your best day every day. Thank you for listening to Deep Impact Investing with Kimberly Griego-Kiel, the sustainable, responsible impact investing podcast, reminding you that it's time to invest like you give a damn. If you have questions about this podcast or topics you'd like to hear addressed on an upcoming podcast, please email me at kim@griego-kiel.com. That's GRIEGO-KIEL.com. Or give Horizons a call at 505-982-9661 and be sure to ask for Johan Clausen. Don't forget to click the subscribe button to be notified when new episodes become available, and to share this podcast with colleagues, friends, and family. The companies I may speak about during the podcast are not recommendations for investment. Only you and your financial advisor can determine what the right investments are for you. Kimberly Griego-Kiel produces this podcast on behalf of Horizons Sustainable Financial Services. Horizons Sustainable Financial Services, Inc. is a registered investment advisor registered with the SEC. Horizons Sustainable Financial Services, Inc. and its financial professionals do not render tax or legal advice. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the host and/or guests, and does not necessarily represent the views and opinions of Horizons Sustainable Financial Services, Inc. This content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service providers with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning. None of this content may be used or duplicated without the express written agreement of the podcast host.